Nolan Greaves walked into the fourth body shop in 2 weeks and got the same answer he had gotten from the 3 before it. The frame was compromised beyond repair. The 1969 Ford Mustang Mach-1 that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that needed to be written off. The estimates for the restoration had climbed to $340,000 across 4 quotes, and a fifth shop on the east side of Calgary had already left a voicemail saying they could see him Tuesday if he wanted to come in and hear the same thing in person. Nolan Greaves was 52 years old and had spent the last 14 years building Greaves Fleet Solutions into the largest commercial vehicle leasing company in Western Canada. He managed a portfolio of 4,200 units across 3 provinces. He had negotiated contracts with municipal governments and handled procurement disputes with manufacturers who had lawyers on retainer for exactly that purpose. He was not a man who lost arguments, and he was not a man who lost things he valued. The Mach-1 was the one item in his life that occupied both categories at once. His father, Bernard Greaves, had purchased the car new in 1969 from a dealership in Medicine Hat and had driven it to his wedding that same year. Nolan had grown up in the passenger seat. He had learned to drive in that car on an empty stretch of highway outside Lethbridge, his father's hand on the dash and his foot finding the clutch with the kind of methodical patience that only a man who truly loved a machine could sustain. When Bernard died 3 winters ago, the Mach-1 had passed to Nolan with a handwritten note inside the glove box that said simply, "Take care of it the way it took care of us." Nolan had kept the note in the same glove box. He had kept everything exactly as it was, right up until the morning a distracted driver on Crowchild Trail had put the front end of a delivery van into the driver's side quarter panel at 40 kilometers an hour and changed the arithmetic of everything. The insurance company had called it a total loss within 48 hours. Nolan had declined the payout and signed the paperwork to retain the vehicle. That decision had cost him the settlement and launched him into a 4-shop odyssey that had now consumed 2.5 weeks and produced nothing but increasingly expensive agreements that the car could not be saved for any reasonable sum. He was standing in the parking lot of the 4th shop, keys in his hand, looking at nothing in particular when his brother-in-law called. Not for the first time that week, Nolan let it ring. What he did not let ring 40 minutes later was a call from his son, Declan, who was 24 and worked in the Greaves Fleet Operations office and had apparently spent a portion of his lunch break looking into something he thought Nolan should know about. The name Declan gave him was Miles Turgeon. The address was a property on Range Road 281 outside Okotoks, a 20-minute drive south of the city, which housed a single bay shop that Miles Turgeon had been operating out of for the better part of 18 years without a sign, without a website, and without apparent interest in being found by anyone who hadn't already been told where to look. Declan had heard about it from a man in the Greaves Fleet Maintenance Division who had once watched Miles Turgeon restore a 1967 Shelby GT500 that 3 professional restoration shops in Vancouver had declined to accept because they considered the unibody damage irreversible. The car now lived in a private collection in Victoria and had been appraised at $640,000. Nolan said he would think about it. He did not think about it. He drove back to the office and sat in his chair and looked at his father's note, which he had removed from the glove box the morning of the accident and placed in the top drawer of his desk where he could see it without opening anything. He looked at the note for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Declan back and asked him for the number. Miles Turgeon answered on the second ring. His voice was the kind of voice that belonged to a man who spent most of his time alone with machines and had organized his speech accordingly. Economy of word, no decorative language, no warmth deployed as a social function. He listened to Nolan describe the car and the damage without interrupting. When Nolan finished, there was a pause. Then Miles said, "Bring it out tomorrow if you can, early." The property on Range Road 281 was flat and wide and the kind of Alberta quiet that cities forget exists. A gravel lane ran from the road to a structure that had once been a machine shed and had been converted over time into something more purposeful. The bay door was open when Nolan arrived at 7 in the morning, and a single fluorescent tube lit the interior with the thin white clarity of a room accustomed to close examination. The Mach-1 arrived on a flatbed at 20 past. Miles Turgeon walked out when the truck pulled in, wiping his hands on a cloth, and stood watching the car come down the ramp with his arms at his sides and his expression unchanged. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, compact and unhurried in the way of a man who had never needed speed to accomplish what he was after. He wore a canvas work shirt and trousers that had been washed enough times to lose any color they once had. He had a grease line along his right forearm and a way of holding himself that reminded Nolan of his father's mechanic from the old days on the south side of Lethbridge, a man who could walk into a shop and know what was wrong with a car before he touched it. The way certain people know what is wrong with other people before a word is exchanged. Miles circled the Mach 1 twice with his hands behind his back, not touching anything. Nolan watched him and found the patience difficult to match. He had an 8:30 call he had already moved, and a board presentation at noon that he had asked his assistant to restructure around a slot for him to return the flatbed trailer to the yard. He was not accustomed to standing on gravel at 7:30 in the morning, waiting for someone to finish looking at something they hadn't touched yet. He laid out the situation the way he had laid it out 4 times already. The impact, the insurance assessment, the 4 shop evaluations, the consensus opinion that the frame rails were bent beyond spec and the structural integrity of the unibody was too compromised for safe restoration. He used the language of the reports he had read: torque box deformation, rocker panel intrusion, a pillar deviation, because he wanted to know whether the man in front of him was fluent or merely familiar. Miles listened. Then he asked 2 questions. The first, had the car been on a frame machine before any of the 4 assessments were done? Nolan said no. The second, was he willing to leave the car and not come back for 10 days? Nolan looked at him. 10 days, Miles said. I work alone. I don't give progress reports. If you need updates, I'm not the right person. He said it without aggression or apology, simply as information. Nolan thought about his father sitting in the driver's seat of the Mach 1 on the highway outside Lethbridge with the window down and his elbow on the door, and the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed into correctness. He handed Miles the keys. On the 3rd day, he drove past Range Road 281 twice on his way back from a client meeting in Okotoks. He did not turn in. He drove to the city and sat in traffic on Deerfoot, and thought about the frame machine question, which had been sitting in a back corner of his mind since the morning he had left the car. None of the 4 shops had mentioned a frame machine at the start of their assessments. They had arrived at their conclusions through measurement and visual inspection and diagnostic tools. He did not know enough about frame restoration to understand why that mattered, but he knew enough about diagnostic processes from fleet management to know that the sequence of steps sometimes changed the conclusion you arrived at. On the 5th day, Declan came into his office and set a printed page on the desk without saying anything first. Nolan looked at it. It was a biography pulled from a trade publication archive, dated 11 years earlier, profiling the finalists of a restoration competition in Pebble Beach. The 5th name on the list was Miles Turgeon, Okotoks, Alberta, for a 1965 Pontiac GTO that the judge's notes described as technically extraordinary, exhibiting frame correction work of a precision rarely encountered outside factory restoration programs. Miles had not attended the ceremony. The award had been accepted by the car's owner. The publication noted that Mr. Turgeon had declined to be interviewed. Nolan read the page twice. He set it beside the note from his father's glove box and looked at both of them together. Then he told Declan to close the door on his way out. On the 7th day, a man named Gordon from his fleet maintenance division mentioned in passing that he had once met Miles Turgeon at a parts supplier in High River and had gotten exactly 4 sentences out of him before Miles had turned back to what he was looking at. He told Nolan this the way people tell stories they find amusing. Nolan did not find it amusing. He found it familiar in a way he could not immediately name. He called his brother-in-law back that evening. His brother-in-law had been suggesting since the first week that Nolan should take the insurance money, let the car go, buy something new and appropriate for a man his age. He said it with genuine affection and a kind of reasonable practicality that Nolan had always found both understandable and completely beside the point. Some things were not decisions about money and never had been. His brother-in-law was a good man who had not grown up in the passenger seat of a 1969 Mach 1 on a highway outside Lethbridge in the particular slant of late afternoon sun that decade produced, and so he could not be expected to fully account for what he was asking Nolan to release. Nolan told him the car would be ready in 3 days and left it at that. On the 9th day, he drove out to Range Road 281 without intending to. It was a Saturday early enough that the light was still low and the gravel was wet with the previous night's rain. The bay door was open. Miles was inside. Nolan sat in his truck at the end of the lane for 10 minutes before getting out. Miles saw him and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Come in." The Mach 1 was on the frame machine. Nolan had seen frame machines before in the fleet division, industrial units used on commercial trucks. But this was something closer to an instrument than a tool, calibrated and precise in a way that changed the quality of the surrounding air. The car was held at 17 points with a geometry he could not immediately interpret, but that had the look of something constructed with great care over many individual decisions. The body panels on the driver's side had been removed and placed on a wooden rack along the wall. The frame rails were exposed and illuminated by a pair of work lights that Miles had positioned at low angles so that every surface deviation cast a shadow. "The frame is not compromised," Miles said. He said it with the same tone he might use to describe the weather. The driver's side rail sustained a primary impact load at the front torque box, and there was secondary deflection along the lower rocker section. The A-pillar moved 4 millimeters out of spec. He paused. "All of it is within correctable tolerance on a unibody of this construction. There is nothing here that cannot be addressed." Nolan did not say anything immediately. He was doing the arithmetic of what he had just heard against 3.5 weeks of being told the opposite by people he had paid to tell him the truth. "The reason it looked terminal on inspection," Miles continued, "is that the deformation pattern on this generation of unibody is counterintuitive. The visible damage at the quarter panel and rocker was dramatic enough that every shop would have measured from those points outward. But the structural load in a side impact on a 69 Mach 1 distributes rearward through the torque box before it presents at the visible damage site. If you measure the visible damage first, the numbers look catastrophic. If you put it on a machine and work from the primary load point forward, you find out what actually moved and what only looks like it moved." He pointed to the front torque box, a section Nolan would not have known to look at. "The movement here," Miles said, "is less than 3 millimeters. The rest followed from that. It was not complicated, it just required the machine and the sequence." Nolan looked at the car for a long time. He thought about the 4 shops. He thought about the reports with their professional language and their carefully assembled conclusions and their prices. He thought about the fact that not one of them had put the car on a machine before drawing a conclusion, not because they were careless or dishonest, but because the visible damage had been persuasive enough that it closed the question before it was properly open. He had gone to 4 qualified people and asked what was wrong with the quarter panel. Not one of them had gone looking for what was wrong with the torque box. Miles had asked the machine first, then he had listened to the answer. Nolan turned from the car and noticed the wall behind the workbench for the first time. There was a photograph, older, slightly faded, of a younger Miles standing beside a dark green muscle car in what appeared to be a competition bay, the Pebble Beach show in the background. Beside him stood a woman, her arm through his, laughing at something outside the frame. And at their feet, a boy of about 4, crouched down and looking at the car's wheel arch with an expression of absolute uncomplicated seriousness. Nolan looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked away. He asked Miles what the total would be. Miles said he would have it in writing Monday morning. He said the work would be completed in the next 10 days and the car would pass a safety inspection before it left the property. He said these things in the same flat, informative register he used for everything. Then Nolan asked something he had not planned to ask. He had spent 3 weeks in the orbit of this situation and had gathered almost no personal information about Miles Turgeon beyond the trade publication page Declan had printed. He asked because the photograph was there, and the woman was laughing, and the boy was crouched down looking at the wheel arch with his father's kind of seriousness. He asked if Miles had family nearby. Miles picked up a measuring gauge from the bench and examined it without turning around. His son, he said, was living in Edmonton. Good work, solid head. They talked on Sundays. He set the gauge down. His wife had passed 6 years ago, ovarian cancer, quick once it started. He said this without drama, the way certain people describe permanent things, accurately and without seeking a response. Nolan said he was sorry. Miles nodded once, which appeared to be the end of the territory he had allocated to the subject. He looked at the car. "The shop teaches you to be patient," he said after a moment. "Either that or it breaks you." He picked up the measuring gauge again. "She taught me the same thing in a different way." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't always get to choose the classroom." Nolan drove back to Calgary in a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of nothing, but the silence of too many things at once. The cost of 3.5 weeks of expert consensus that had been expensive and wrong, the photograph on the wall, the boy with his father's expression examining something he was not yet old enough to fully understand but already knew deserved serious attention. He thought about his father, who had always said that the most valuable thing in any room was the person asking the questions nobody else thought to ask. He had thought for years that his father meant it as a business principle. He was beginning to understand that his father had meant it more broadly. 2 weeks later, the Mach 1 came back on the same flatbed, down the same gravel lane behind Nolan's property in the southwest. Nolan walked out when he heard the truck and stood at the edge of the lane watching the car come down the ramp. The driver's side panel was reinstalled. The paint was not a full respray, only where the work required it, matched with a precision that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The geometry was correct. The car sat on its suspension with the level, settled authority it had always carried, the authority of a machine built in a decade when certain things were simply made right and expected to last. He got in and drove it south out of the city, onto the highway toward Lethbridge, which he had not done in 3 years, and which he had not planned to do this afternoon. The Mach 1 shifted through its gears without complaint. The engine pulled clean and full through the top of its range. The steering was exactly as he remembered it from boyhood, firm and honest and entirely present, the steering of a car that communicated with the road and chose to share the information. He drove for 40 minutes and then pulled off onto a side road he recognized from decades ago, a stretch of gravel bordered by open field, the kind of road that exists in southern Alberta in great quiet abundance, and he stopped the car and sat with the engine running and the window down and the late afternoon light doing what it always did at that hour in that part of the province. He had come very close to taking the insurance payout. He had come very close to letting 4 shops tell him that the arithmetic of loss was final. He had spent 3.5 weeks being very confident in the testimony of credentialed people who had all looked at the same visible damage, and not one of them had thought to find out where the load actually went first. Miles Turgeon had quoted him $4,800 for the work. He had sent a check for $9,000 and received no acknowledgement of the difference, which he had not expected and did not require. Before leaving the property in Okotoks on the day he picked up the car, Nolan had asked Miles what the right question was, the one that changed what you found. Miles had looked at him for a moment with the level, unhurried attention of a man who considered the question genuine and therefore worth an honest answer. Where the force went first, he said. Not where the damage landed. Those are 2 different problems. People look at where it ended up and think that's where it started. He paused. It almost never is. Nolan sat with the engine idling on the gravel road outside Lethbridge and thought about that sentence in the same way he had been turning it over since the day Miles had said it. He thought about it in relation to the car, and in relation to a number of other things that had nothing to do with automotive repair, and everything to do with the way problems actually worked if you were willing to follow them to their origin rather than accepting them at the point where they finally became visible. He put the Mach 1 in gear and drove back toward the city. The sun was going down in the particular way it goes down over the Alberta prairie, slowly and completely as if it intends to be thorough about it. He drove with the window down and his elbow on the door, the same way his father always had on this same road in this same light. He did not turn on the radio.